Jackson. His interests include the work of Michel Foucault, the Victorian novel, African American literature, and monsters. And he's currently a lecturer in the English department at the University of Texas, Arlington.
Daniel, is that angle good, or do you want me to just?
I'm good. I think this will be fine. Sorry, my grandmother only let me leave town if I recorded what I was doing. So, so anyway, so hi Nana. And yes, thank you very much for the introduction, Sophie. That was an amazing paper. Thank you very much for being here. My paper is entitled Mina Interrupted, Ellipsis in Dracula. So this is a long time coming, and I've been working on it for now a decade probably, which is exhausting. But I think it'll be cool, so enjoy the handout and everything else. So. A wonderful aspect of studying Dracula in depth is that once you begin looking for a particular topic as you read, you keep finding examples. When I first proposed this paper, I expected to spend the whole 20 minutes coming back to one specific ellipsis inserted by Mina Harker into her transcription of Seward's phonographic diary. And while that's where we're going to start, the sheer number of interruptions that I found have expanded the scope a bit. Interruptions in the text seem to beget more interruptions, and so the title of this paper has become more metaphorical as I've written. So if it seems like I'm wandering off the topic, it's because I am. The titular ellipsis occurs within a letter written by Seward's assistant, which reports the conditions of everything left in his charge. That's on side A, it's the very top one. The excluded part of the letter presumably contains information about Renfield's fellow inmates in the asylum, with the report of Renfield himself included in full. Mina's use of an ellipsis here is a piece with what Jennifer Wick notes as an ample textual confusion surrounding the elements of Seward's diary, like abbreviations and chemical formulas that do not have meaning orally. Notice that Patrick Hennessy's long list of titles are included, even though presumably Seward didn't actually say MD, MRCL, S, so forth. After all, an ellipsis is just a representation of what isn't said. It has no oral meaning. We don't say ellipsis, period, as you would if you were actually transcribing this perfectly. For the novel, the exclusion of Seward's notes about other patients serves a clear narrative purpose by keeping the focus of the entire insane asylum on the one patient with narrative meaning. Renfield is, after all, an index to Dracula's movements, and therefore needs to be prominently featured. But what this ellipsis points to, in my view, is the active nature of Mina's typing. She isn't simply transcribing the narrative the way a lady journalist uses shorthand to write down a conversation at talking speed. She's actually editing it. This point is strengthened if we remember that Seward has other patients besides Renfield, and he's keeping his other notes using the same method and the same records. At the point at which Mina begins transcribing Seward's diary, none of the characters know that Renfield is Dracula's index. The salient points of the diary are therefore only discovered after Mina has transcribed the entire thing. She has to have, because Seward can't find anything specific on the record. That points to the vast amount of Seward's narrative that Mina types and then excludes, because the photograph lacks an index in order to find particular patients or even dates. And in order to have information available to share with the men, Mina, quote, used his manifold and took 3 copies of the diary just as I had done with all the rest. All the rest. That's my emphasis. In more general terms, Van Helsing can't read shorthand, Jonathan doesn't type, and Seward doesn't know how to read his own phonograph. Who do you think is doing the work of sifting through the massive typewriting that got excluded? My money is on the secretary, who goes all over the papers carefully in order to arrive at some conclusion, thinking without prejudice on the facts before her. It's from here that I differ with Jennifer Fleissner's argument that Mina is fundamentally a stenographer. She's not. She's doing more than stenography. So we take that as our starting point, which I admit is a big take. We have to reject the idea that we have nothing in Dracula but a mass of typewriting, as Jonathan calls it. Whatever minimizing that he and Van Helsing attempt in the final note for the novel, everything that we read in the novel points to an enormous amount of work by Mina. The document Dracula that we end up with isn't an authentic one, it is an authored one, placed in particular order to create specific effects. It's actually a mass of typewriting by Mina, not just a mass. And while this is on one level ridiculous to ask what a fictional character intended to do with her typewriter, the effects of what that typewriter does are worth considering as coming from that character. So Mina doesn't have agency, she's not a real person, but nevertheless, that's the vector from which the typewriting comes. Thus, when an interruption happens within the structure of a novel, we have to ascribe that interruption to Mina because Mina is the one doing all the typing. If something interrupts something, Mina is the one making that choice somehow. These interruptions include ellipsis, or interruptions within a particular epistle, so this isn't the only ellipsis in the novel, there's several, but also elements like subtitles, parenthetical notes about content, even the ordering of the novel. That is what Russian formalists call the fabula of the epistolary novel. Although these are subtle, they still create interesting effects for the reader and are worth examining just, as a person who's obsessed with this novel. One of my favorite examples comes from the beginning of chapter 7, which is also on your handout. It reads like this: cutting from the Daily Graph, 8 August, pasted in Mina Murray's journal from correspondent Whitby. And that's sort of badly typographically what it appears like in the novel. That parenthetical note must have been inserted by Mina at the typescript stage, because it would make no sense for her to have written such a thing in her own private journal. You don't paste something and say, I pasted this. That's not how that works. And even as a small interruption, it nevertheless has a surprisingly large effect. By calling attention to Mina's actions before the arrival of Dracula in England and before she's read Jonathan's diary, Mina indicates her own awareness of the world around her, demonstrating that she's an active reader and in some sense archivist of the daily papers, and importantly, saves information that documents Dracula's arrival to Whitby before she knows that that's going to be a problem. Coupled with her minute awareness of train schedules, her ambitions with journalism, shorthand, and the typewriter, even her knowing mockery of the new woman's political ambitions, it's clear that Mina is an active consumer of information well before she's a vampire. Mina actually interrupts herself with this parenthetical phrase in order to prove her information bona fides to the reader. She's demonstrating, I'm paying attention to things. Pay attention to me. As a typist, she interrupts the fabula as well as other characters at various points in the novel. So everyone see what I'm drawing attention to? No one has any objections right now? Okay. So from Mina's interruptions of others and herself, we can look to other ones in the novel. At different points, both Dracula and Van Helsing create interruptions in the behavior of other characters. And it's notable that the forms of these interruptions often echo or mirror each other. For example, just as Dracula interrupts the brides from feeding on Jonathan, Van Helsing interrupts Lucy from feeding on Arthur. Just as Dracula interrupts Jonathan from sending letters home, Van Helsing interrupts the possibilities of inquest into Lucy and her mother's deaths. Like there's a bunch of forgery that's happening between the both of them. And of course, the interruptions of each other, Van Helsing and Dracula, drive a great deal of the plot, especially when it comes to Lucy's care. Dracula interrupts Lucy's sleep to induce her to sleepwalk, while Van Helsing interrupts Dracula's feeding through the applications of garlic, blood transfusions, and crucifixes. In effect, they try to out-interrupt each other. But the interruption most interesting to me is when both of them interrupt Mina at the same crucial moment, which allows her to be attacked and then partially vampirized. This interruption happens on September 30th, and this is where the dates start getting a little crazy, which is the day that the crew of Light unconsciously formed a sort of board or committee. Professor Van Helsing took the head of the table and asked me to act as secretary, me being Mina, in order to construct a plan for destroying Dracula before he can gain a foothold in London and begin spreading the vampire plague. This is the moment in the novel when Van Helsing finally explains everything he knows about vampirism to both the crew of Light, so all the men, and the reader. And it's also the point at which all the records they have are complete and in order, chronologically put in this exact order by, Seward tells Van Helsing, Jonathan and Mina. Now, this is a very important point that I'm going to say. Only one person can use a typewriter at a time. So if Seward's hearing typing, it's probably not Jonathan typing the typing. During the meeting, Mina swears to take part in the proceedings alongside the men, records everything that Van Helsing has to say. Most importantly for our purposes, the list of Dracula's abilities, including he has several times transformed into a bat. At this point, we are interrupted in a very startling way, which is what the novel says and which is where this paper came from, by Morris, who has left the house, firing his revolver at a big bat who is sat on the windowsill. The meeting is interrupted by Dracula in his transformed shape, and no one seems to make the obvious assumption that it's Dracula as a bat. Like, everyone seems to miss that. Crucially, Dracula's interrupted them after Van Helsing reveals that the plan is to go to Carfax, giving him clear insight into what is going to happen. So he's been listening, paying attention, and now knows where they're headed next. And then Van Helsing makes his own interruption. And now for you, Madam Mina, the night is the end until all be well. He stops her from her secretarial work and interrupts her involvement in the Crew of Light. She's sworn in, she's part of it, she's the secretary, and then she's kicked out immediately. Just at the same time that Dracula's interrupted the committee. This exclusion from the vampire hunt only leaves her vulnerable to attack from the vampire, just as Van Helsing's policy of ignorance previously doomed Lucy and her mother. Like, we don't tell the women things, bad things happen to the women. Thus, the two interruptions actually feed into one another. Dracula knows that the crew is going to attack Carfax, and so waits for them there. But when Mina does not attend with them, having been interrupted in her own part of the work, he then enters the asylum and attacks her. This is when the interruptions start piling on top of each other. As a result of losing our secretary, time itself seems to become interrupted. It's important to note at this point that though the novel is an epistolary, it's not actually in chronological order. Mina assembles it into a chronological order for the vampire hunt, but as a fabula, there are quite often time shifts along with shifts in narrator. For example, we read the entirety of Jonathan's diary from May 3rd to June 30th, and then jump backwards to May 8th to read Mina's portion of the beginning of the novel. Likewise, the log of the Demeter is inserted all at once, even though events of the ship overlap with Seward's treatment of Renfield and Mina's and Lucy's adventures in Whitby. So we kind of jump backwards and have a chunk of chronological time. There are quite often stretches in the novel where a character is uninterrupted in their conversation, even though this means that time does not flow in a linear fashion in the novel. Okay, so if we disassemble the novel, this is where we get a little crazy. We disassemble the novel to compare the sujet of the events with the fabula of the novel. Something strange happens at the point where Mina is interrupted in the work. The plot order of events at the beginning of October seem to interrupt previously established orderly flow of time. Because there is some rapid shifting between narrators at this point, the entries and events of October 1 and 2 become entangled with one another, as you can see in table. So on A, everyone can see that there's a lot of straight lines and there's a lot of like crazy lines. That's what happens. All right, so here I want to shout out the excellent Dracula Daily Project, which emails subscribers of the events of each date in the novel on the corresponding day. So on June 9th, you get all of the June 9th. I used it as a resource for this paper. And it's also got a bunch of really excellent memes on the internet if you're into that kind of thing. The italics in the date column are what appear in the novel, while the parentheses are my editorial notes. So when they didn't name a time, I read it and figured out what time it was based on context. There are several important points I want to draw your attention to. First, see the time continues chronologically until the point that Mina gets to speak. Her entry for 2 October is the first indication that we won't be traveling minute by minute as the men search for Dracula. So we went 4 a.m., 5 a.m., October 1, October 2, back to October 1. Second, in addition to the rapidly vacillating dates of these entries, the time of day that each entry occurs in the novel's order also shifts rather erratically. Thus, we have 2 different entries from Jonathan on October 2, followed by an afternoon entry from Seward. For the reader, Jonathan and Seward's interruption of each other contributes to the intense confusion of the moment when the men are focused on locating Dracula's boxes while losing track of his physical and non-physical presences. This might seem to violate Mina's secretarial efforts in compiling an accurate record of this matter where dates are everything, as she terms it. In effect, Van Helsing and Dracula have interrupted the person whose job it is to keep things in order, and therefore events fall out of order. Nevertheless, the chronology of each individual narrator remains intact, i.e. Jonathan's diary separated out from the other entries still flows linearly, so that if we organize it too much more closely with the order offered by other parts of the novel, i.e. a speaker goes uninterrupted for a period of time, you might get something like the B side, okay? And this is incredibly technical, and I recognize this is when I got the red string out and started acting like a loon. But what happens is, even though Seward and Jonathan are sort of bouncing back and forth time-wise, Seward is consistently linear the whole way through. So Seward's time remains forward, for whatever that means. Like Neil Gaiman says, it's up to the reader to decide what's happening in Whitby, to connect Renfield's rants and behavior in the asylum with the events that happen in the house next door. And so Scott Rogers labels Dracula an example of ergodic literature, because the reader has to do a bunch of work in order to understand exactly what's going on. And I'm taking that quite literally and becoming a paranoid reader, like in a very serious sense here. So my manipulation of the text is a manipulation, but it's a critical one that actually flows from what the novel is asking us to do, I think. So during this seeming interruption of linear time, the chronology of the individual speakers is maintained, even as they interrupt each other. Thus, the speaker order, which also mirrors the fabula of the novel at the points where Mina is not being kept from the work, becomes a useful way of keeping track of the sujet, or the plot order. When you compare the novel to the chronological order from the previous chart and to the speaker order, something telling stands out. In the throes of being interrupted in her work by both Dracula and Van Helsing, Mina is the only writer who isn't interrupted. That is, where the novel placed in true chronological order, Mina's second entry would appear in the last position of those 2 days. Instead, Mina's 2 journal entries are kept together. Her entry for October 2 is the point where time is interrupted by a shift forward the first time. After that entry, Jonathan and Seward's work becomes completely nonlinear, where they have been highly synchronized beforehand. So again, if we look at A, lots of straight lines, and then suddenly things go haywire. Thus, Mina is both uninterrupted and interrupting. And given the subtle interruptions that Mina enacts at other points of the novel, this unique section of time in the novel, while she's being interrupted concurrently by Van Helsing and Dracula, seems the perfect place to ask that what her interruptions and uninterruptions are meant to do, or why are they here? Because she's doing them. She's put it in this order for this particular reason. So, it's a critical commonplace that the novel is about the flow of information in the late 19th century. Leah Richards, for example, points out that the novel expresses and contains anxieties of the period, particularly those inherent to the dissemination of information. And interruptions in that dissemination of create several disastrous moments in that define the novel's plot. What that has meant in practice, however, is a critical focus on the dissemination or lack of it made by Dracula and Van Helsing, not by Mina. What this moment in the novel points to, then, is a triumvirate of interrupting characters in conflict with each other. Mina is not a hapless pawn to be moved around by the men, but an adept user of the flow of information to manipulate those around her, even in the moments when she's not allowed to access information. Such a thing becomes obvious in the final events of the novel as Dracula attempts to keep his movements a secret, literally stopping Mina from speaking. When that happens, it's her idea to have Van Helsing hypnotize her when Dracula's powers are interrupted by the dawn. So Dracula gets interrupted in his own powers, and his interruption of Mina gets interrupted, and she's the one who interrupts Van Helsing's sleep to get him to help her speak. After interrupting each other for most of the novel, Van Helsing and Mina working in concert is finally what sends the vampire back to Transylvania. And it's, of course, by Mina's efforts as a secretary and strategist that the crew can attack Dracula's pathway to his castle. She's the one who figures out where he's going to be. In a novel where the major problems are the result of failure to share information, where one of the vampire's powers is to compel silence from the victims, Mina's consistent rejection of information hierarchy is the solution to the vampire plague. Thus, the effect of Mina's successes in the contests of interruption, even at the end, interrupting Van Helsing from being eaten by the brides, just as he interrupts Arthur and Dracula interrupts Jonathan, points to the ultimate aim as a secretary of the novel, her aim of democratizing information. How else can we understand Mina's heartfelt exhortation of Seward that the crew need have no secrets amongst us? Working together and with absolute trust, we can surely be stronger than if some of us were in the dark. Another way to think about it is that Mina's interruption at this key moment disrupts another information hierarchy. By interrupting the Min's search for Dracula with the story of her own rape, Mina is giving the reader more information than she's allowed to get from the rest of the crew. We know where Dracula is before the Min know where Dracula is. And so, I think that's probably the end of the conversation. Thank you.